Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, August 16th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. NATO suggests that Ukraine could cede territory. So a NATO official has suggested that Ukraine could cede some territory to Russia in exchange for joining the Western Military Alliance. So these comments were made on Tuesday by Stian Jensen, who's the chief of staff for NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And this was reported by the Norwegian newspaper VG. So Jensen said, quote, "I think that a solution could be for Ukraine to give up territory and get NATO membership in return," end quote. He added that it should ultimately be up to Ukraine when and on what terms to negotiate. So Jensen said that the issue of Ukraine's status after the war is being discussed within the alliance, and that some countries have raised the possibility of Kiev ceding some territory. The comments come as the Ukrainian counteroffensive is stalling, and Western officials are admitting that it's very unlikely to succeed. So this is interesting because this is the first time that a high-level NATO official suggested Ukraine might have to cede territory to Russia. The US and NATO have backed Ukraine's demands for peace, which include Russia withdrawing from all the territory that it has captured since invading, and they also want Russia to give up Crimea, which it has controlled since 2014, so very maximalist demands that are a non-starter for negotiations with Moscow. So definitely interesting to see, a high-level official within the alliance say this. So Jensen's suggestion drew a sharp rebuke from Ukraine. So Mikhailo Podolyak, he's an advisor to Zelensky. He was not happy with what Jensen had to say. He said, quote, "Trading territory for a NATO umbrella, it is ridiculous. That means deliberately choosing the defeat of democracy, encouraging a global criminal, preserving the Russian regime, destroying international law, and passing the war on to other generations," end quote. So Podolyak said that the war could only end if Russian President Vladimir Putin is defeated. He said, quote, "Obviously, if Putin does not suffer a crushing defeat, the political regime in Russia does not change, and war criminals are not punished. The war will definitely return with Russia's appetite for more," end quote. So realistically, it's unlikely that Russia would go for any kind of deal like this right now, as long as they could keep this war going, at least. Because, if Ukraine agreed to cede territory to Russia in exchange for them joining NATO, one of Russia's main motives for the invasion was Ukraine's alignment with NATO. One of its main demands, one of its really only demands in the early days of the war, when there were those very short-lived negotiations, they weren't asking for territory. They were asking for NATO, for Ukraine to declare neutrality. So that's, kind of the big thing. Since then, their demands have changed. Now Russia does say that the territory it's annexed in the eastern Ukrainian oblasts must be recognized as Russian. If, this is something we always talk about, if Ukraine negotiated a deal in the early days of the war, they could have kept, all the territory that they had, except for Crimea. Obviously, Russia's never going to give that up, but, they just would be in much better position and a lot less people would be dead. But now, hundreds of thousands of people are probably dead and they're going to end up with much less territory. Realistically, it doesn't look like they can regain any significant territory now, the way this counteroffensive has been going. All right, speaking of the counteroffensive, the next one here, mine blast injuries haunt doctors amid Ukraine's counteroffensive. So this is an article from the Washington Post, and it's a pretty brutal account from doctors in Ukraine who are, doing amputations and surgeries and treating mind blast victims. So I'm just going to read A little bit here from this article. Bodies ripped to pieces, arms and legs mangled beyond recognition. The mental anguish of amputating limb after limb after limb is a grim reality of Ukraine's counteroffensive. 4 doctors working in the Zaporozhye region. Heavily mined Russian defenses have slowed Ukraine's attack to a bloody, painstaking crawl, and hard-won gains come at the cost of mine blast injuries more abundant than some medical professionals say they have seen in the war thus far. With Russian forces having dug in over months, any push to regain territory means traversing land dense with mines, even as civilians far from the front lines also grapple with a diffusion of mines and other explosives in previously contested areas across much of the country. So they quote a Ukrainian military surgeon, Dmytro Mielkovitsky, and he has worked in the country since the start of the war, basically just saying there's mines everywhere. He has treated more mine blast injuries since the start of the counteroffensive in early June than in his previous work during the war. So it just goes to show how many of these injuries are. And there was that recent Wall Street Journal report that I covered that said somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 Ukrainians have lost limbs in this war. And these are amputations on the scale of World War I. So again, it's the human cost of this war that we don't really know, what the true toll is, because Ukraine is not sharing casualty figures. Russia is not either. So it's just tough to know really what the true number is. But, like I said, it's likely in the hundreds of thousands dead, and, who knows how many wounded. And, if there's really in the tens of thousands of people losing limbs, I think that shows that the casualty rate could be really, really, horrifically high. And this is something the U.S. just doesn't seem to care about. They look at all this as a net positive. Not one American soldier has been killed. Americans that volunteered have died, but, they don't care so much about the Ukrainian lives that are being lost. All right, the next one here, bribes and hiding Ukrainian men trying to avoid conscription. And this is an article from The Guardian about Ukrainian men who've been trying to avoid getting drafted and thrown onto the front lines. And I thought this was just interesting. They talked to one man who left Ukraine, and he had papers showing that he had a serious spinal injury, thus exempting him from military service and from the ban on adult men leaving the country. And his account is basically, he showed these papers to the soldiers at the border checkpoint, and they basically knew that it was fake, that this guy paid $5,000 to get these papers. And this is something that's pretty widespread. People with money have been able to avoid the draft, which is the case in throughout history really of drafts. But there's been a lot of corruption apparently with the draft office, and this is something that Kyle covered over the weekend when I was off, was that Zelensky fired every regional military recruitment head in the country, citing endemic corruption in the apparatus. So because of these bribes that were taken, Zelensky cleaned house. And then this article also gets into, it's pretty long, and again, talking with Ukrainians who are dealing with this, people that don't have the money to bribe these officials who are trying to avoid conscription. There's social media resources, people letting them know when, military recruiters are showing up, or, in some cases at nightclubs, they come in and close the place down and grab all the men. So that's the thing that these people are dealing with, throwing them into vans to throw them into this brutal war that's going on. All right. So the next one here, Blinken urges Congress to okay new Ukraine funds. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Tuesday called on Congress to approve President Biden's request for an additional $24 billion in spending on the Ukraine war right away. So the White House formally made the request to Congress last week. If this new spending is approved, it will bring total U.S. spending on the war to $137 billion. Blinken told reporters that he urged Congress to pass this supplemental funding. So supplemental funding, they call it emergency funding, is not limited by the debt ceiling deal that was reached between the White House and House Republicans. So House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, he's previously expressed that he might not support a supplemental funding bill that would blow past the spending limits. But on the other hand, he's a very staunch supporter of the proxy war against Russia. So I would be surprised if he holds this up, if he blocks this. I haven't seen any comments from him about this. I was trying to find it. I'm sure some reporters have asked him, but I didn't see anything anywhere. But over in the Senate, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is eager to approve the new Ukraine aid. He's saying that he wants to address it as quickly as possible. So we might see this be brought to the Senate floor pretty soon. And this $24 billion in Ukraine spending is part of a $40 billion supplemental bill that also includes domestic disaster relief and funds for border security. And then the breakdown of this $24 billion again is $13 billion in military aid, $7.3 billion in economic and humanitarian aid, and $3.3 billion for infrastructure projects for regional countries impacted by the conflict. And so what's interesting is that infrastructure spending is included in the name of countering China. So in a letter to McCarthy, the director of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, when making the request for this spending, said, quote, "It is essential that we offer a credible alternative to the People's Republic of China's coercive and unstable lending and infrastructure projects for developing countries around the world," end quote. So I just thought it was interesting that they threw that in there. Kind of combining Ukraine spending with, the new Cold War against China. So this request for the new spending, it comes after that CNN poll that found the majority of Americans, 55%, are opposed to Congress authorizing more spending on the war. But the Biden administration does not seem fazed by this, and they've made clear that they expect to be fueling the proxy war for the long term. I found this quote from a senior Biden administration official who spoke with reporters last week that I thought was interesting. This official said, quote, "We don't know how much longer this war is going to go on or how much more assistance we might need to support Ukraine. We won't be bashful about going back to Congress beyond the first quarter of next year if we feel like we need to do that," end quote. So saying that they're not going to be afraid to ask Congress for more, in the future, even more than this $24 billion, and admitting that they don't know, they don't have an end game here. They don't have a strategy for this war. They're just saying, it's going to keep going on potentially. And, we're willing to keep fueling this war and spending all this money to keep it going. All right, the next one here, a Bill Kristol-Led group pushes the GOP to support more Ukraine aid. So a group of Republicans led by neoconservative Bill Kristol have launched a campaign to rally GOP support for President Biden's new request for an additional $24 billion in spending on the war. So this organization that was founded by Kristol, it's called Defending Democracy Together. Sounds very nice. They launched Republicans for Ukraine, which is a $2 million project that will begin airing ads calling for GOP support for Ukraine. And these ads were supposed to be launched on Tuesday. And they're expected to run through the end of the year. And they're going to air on Fox News during the first Republican presidential debate next week. According to the Washington Post, the group has gathered testimony from more than 50 pro-Ukraine Republican voters for the ads. So the frontrunner, which is Trump, he's saying that he's not going to keep supporting this war. So, this is what why they're really launching this. And also because there is more, there are Republicans opposed to this in the House. Unfortunately, I don't think enough to actually stop it, but maybe it's a good sign that you got the neocons getting scared about this growing opposition. So Sarah Longwell, she's a Republican strategist who co-founded this organization with Kristol in 2019. And they started this organization. It was related to Trump's impeachment over the Ukraine, the phone call with Zelensky. So it's kind of all about Ukraine, this organization. But she complained in comments to the Washington Post about the Republican opposition to intervention in Ukraine. She said, quote, "It was alarming in the focus groups to see so many Republican voters talk about Ukraine or Zelensky in disparaging terms, end quote. So that's interesting. And Kristol, I mean, I assume most people know who Bill Kristol is. Very influential neocon. He's kind of lost some of his, influence, I guess, in just because he was so wrong on everything. He's most known for his role in pushing for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He was a co-founder of the Project for a New American Century, which is an infamous neocon think tank that was around in the 1990s that called for Bill Clinton to invade Iraq. They were all about taking out Saddam. And he debated Scott Horton, our editorial director, and I linked to that video there. If you have not seen the debate, it's really amazing. He didn't even try to defend any of the post 9/11 interventions, and Scott really just destroyed him. So anyway, it's just interesting to see them getting nervous. We'll see. Who knows if these ads will really have much impact. But again, hopefully the opposition keeps growing, because that's what we need, or this thing's never going to end. All right, I just want to mention that it is our fundraiser at antiwar.com. We just started it on Monday, and we need your support to get this thing off the ground. Antiwar.com is entirely funded by its readers. That's how we are able to provide you with the type of coverage that we do. Independent, stridently anti-war, non-interventionist, anti-empire. And, besides the news coverage that I do, we also have a great lineup of columnists and original viewpoints. And just, we give a lot of content. If you look at the front page, you got the news, we got the blog, the viewpoint section, and then we have a whole lower news section, kind of minor stories. I shouldn't say minor stories, but not as important as the stuff that we have at top. And that takes, sorting through hundreds of news articles every day. So it's a lot of work that we do as a very small staff. We all put in a lot of hours. And so, your money goes directly to funding the operation. So go to antiwar.com/donate, and you could see the different ways you could help us out. And if you do donate, let me know in the comments, so I could thank you. I really appreciate all the support. I hate asking people for money, especially these days. But this is how we do it, and this is what we got to do. So please help us out, antiwar.com/donate. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. Germany is considering limiting the range of missiles before transfer to Ukraine. So Berlin has been mulling sending its advanced Taurus missiles to Kiev. However, the German government has resisted due to concerns that the missiles could be used to attack Russia, and key components could fall into Moscow's hands. To alleviate these concerns, Berlin may limit the range of the missiles before transferring them to Kiev. So the Taurus missile has a range of over 300 miles. That's much longer than anything NATO has provided up to this point. And they can fly at low altitudes to avoid detection by radar and missile defense systems. Germany has 600 of these missiles in its stockpiles, with 150 ready for combat. So Kiev has really been pushing for these missiles for several months, but Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, has refused to budge. So Der Spiegel, the German outlet, reports that Berlin could alter the missiles to reduce the risk of the transfer. German officials declined to confirm reports, saying there were no updates on Berlin's decision to provide the cruise missiles to Ukraine. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, who knows what level they would limit these missiles at, because 150 miles is still pretty long, and they could. I think that puts Crimea in range, but I know, and it's also the range is what Ukraine is after. They want much longer range missiles. So who knows if they would be happy with this compromise. All right, the next one here. The U.S. cements Japan-Australia military ties. So a new U.S.-backed military pact between Japan and Australia came into effect on Sunday that makes it easier for the two nations to deploy troops to each other's territory. And this is a type of cooperation that the Pentagon has called game-changing. So the Reciprocal Forces Agreement with Australia is the first deal of its kind that Japan has struck with another nation besides the U.S. in the post-World War II era. The U.S. has been encouraging allies in the Asia-Pacific to boost military ties as part of its preparations for a future war with China in the region. So we see a lot of examples of this, of the U.S. forging these stronger alliances in the region. So this agreement will make it less difficult to conduct joint military exercises in each country by relaxing immigration control for troops and simplifying procedures for transporting weapons and ammunition. So a senior Pentagon official told Nikkei Asia, quote, "We're seeing Australia play an increasingly important role in the regional security architecture. What we are aiming to do together in the years ahead, particularly with Japan, will be game-changing for strengthening regional stability," end quote. So according to the Australian Defence Ministry, the initial cooperation under this agreement will include the following. Japanese F-35s will deploy to Australia, and there will be an exercise Bushido Guardian where Australian F-35s will be deployed to Japan for the first time in early September. Australia will participate in exercise Yama Sakura as a full participant for the first time, with more than 150 personnel traveling to Japan in December. So this agreement is just one of many examples of the U.S. looking to forge alliances in the Asia-Pacific as part of its buildup against China, and Japan plays a very integral role in this effort since it hosts the largest U.S. military presence outside of the United States. Something like 38,000 U.S. troops in Japan, a ton of bases, mainly in Okinawa, where people don't want them. The majority of the people that live on the island, the governor included, are against, the U.S. military presence. But that doesn't matter to the U.S. And the U.S. is eyeing another trilateral alliance that involves Japan and South Korea. As I covered yesterday, Biden is hosting Japan's president and Japan's prime minister and South Korea's president at Camp David this Friday. And then other examples of this alliance building is the AUKUS military pact between the U.S., Britain, and Australia. Biden has also been increasing cooperation of the Quad, which is kind of an informal grouping, but they do joint military exercises sometimes, and that's India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S. The U.S. wants to bring the Philippines into this Australia-Japan alliance, so that's another thing that we might see, and that could involve joint patrols in the South China Sea, which could put these countries on a collision course with China. So, this is just a few. There's more. It's just, this kind of goes to show the scale of this U.S. military buildup that's going on in the region. All right, the next one here, ECOWAS military to discuss Niger intervention. So military chiefs from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, will meet in Ghana on Thursday and Friday to discuss potential military intervention in Niger to reinstate ousted President Mohamed Bazoum. So ECOWAS leaders announced last week that they were activating a standby force to restore constitutional order in Niger, but there's no sign yet that an intervention is imminent. The meeting of ECOWAS military chiefs was initially scheduled for this past Saturday, but it was postponed as the bloc said that it wanted to leave room for diplomacy with the junta. So Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, who's the chair of ECOWAS, he's called for a peaceful solution, but is saying that intervention is a last resort. He's not ruling it out. The Niger junta, which calls itself the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, they've shown no sign that they're going to reinstate Bazoum, which is the main demand of ECOWAS and its Western backers, the U.S. and France. So you have them saying that they want a diplomatic solution, but realistically, the thing that they want, the diplomatic solution that they want, is Bazoum being reinstated and the coup being, over, and that's just not going to happen. So that's just where we're at now. And another example of how, the junta is not backing down, on Sunday they claimed that they had evidence to prosecute Bazoum for high treason. So the military junta said in a statement, quote, "The Nigerian government has to date gathered the necessary evidence to prosecute the deposed president and his local and foreign accomplices before the competent national and international authorities for high treason and undermining internal and external security of Niger," end quote. So, just not a good sign that, ECOWAS and is not backing down on their demand to reinstate Bazoum, and the junta is not backing down on their position. So it looks like, we're set up for some kind of clash here. But that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Aaron Mate over at his Substack. Amid staggering Ukrainian toll and souring U.S. polls, Biden seeks billions more for war. One from Ted Snyder, Prigozhin is gone, but Wagner is everywhere. One from J.W. Rich, the bombing of Hiroshima, the crime and cover-up. That's over at the Mises Institute. We have one from Patrick Lawrence, U.S. Press, Spooks, and the Church Committee. That is over at Consortium News. Go check that out. And our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone at her Substack, at her website. It's never about the U.S. president. It's about the U.S. empire. But that is everything from me for today. Again, please help us with our fundraiser, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe to the show, YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Follow me on Twitter. I started posting my articles in the long form on Twitter. I figured why not? Now that I could do it, I might as well try to use that platform more to my advantage. So follow me there. Also follow the antiwar.com account. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.